Travis.
Thank you. Thing works. Yeah, we're good. Greetings, everyone. The long con. It is so good to be back. 4 fucking years is way too long, but exactly. See a lot of old faces in the audience. A lot of older faces in the audience. Let's be honest. I see some new faces too, so that's always encouraging. So for those new faces who may not know me quite so well, I am in fact Travis Friesen. I used to be the InfoSec guy at Merlin, and Merlin, long story short, we kind of did all of the bunch of IT stuff for education, provided internet services for education in Manitoba. And that was a really fun job. I kind of got to do a little bit of everything in security. But at the start of the year, I changed jobs, and now I do infrastructure, my cloud, security at Neo Financial. We're doing some cool stuff at Neo Financial. You want to hear more about that? Come talk to me. Come talk to Mike. Come talk to this guy with the Neo shirt who's, I swear he's not that shy, and find out what we're doing. So yes, it is true. I now work with the cloud. I have become that which I once swore to destroy, but hey, it pays the bills. So anyway, I'd say let's get right into it, but first I got to give you a little bit of context, what I'm talking about. So you spend enough time in InfoSec, you're going to come across the NIST 5 pillars or 5 activities. And it's basically just a way of like categorizing what we do in InfoSec into kind of like 5 categories. And those are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So you'll find that in your day-to-day activities, you're probably spending maybe 90% of your time and certainly 90% of your money in the protect category. This is things like your firewalls, your antivirus, your password vault, security training, all that sort of stuff. That all falls under the protect category. So it gets all the love, and this seems to kind of make sense at first blush, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you can keep the bad guys out of your network in the first place, that's great. That's a win. You get to go home at the end of the day. But the problem is, despite all this time and energy and money we put into protect, the reality is we can never actually reach 100% level of protection, if only for the fact that, humans cannot be 100% secured. This is the reality. Despite what vendors may try to sell you, you just can never get across that boundary. But what if I told you that you could achieve roughly 80-ish% or so coverage on your detect, respond, and recover with just one tool, and that one tool can be had for as little as peanuts, right? And spoilers, you probably guessed from the title of my talk, I am in fact talking about logging. Specifically though, I'm talking about having a mature, centralized logging infrastructure where you have all the hosts or whatever on your network all bringing their logs, typically they're enriched logs, into a single point where you can index them and search them and ideally do incident response from. But you may say, but Travis, I already got logs. I got logs on my firewall. I can look at my firewall and I can see, what machine on my network visited evilsite.com. Isn't that logs? It's like, well, yes, you do have that. You can tell which machine went to a particular website, but can you tell what actual user went to that website? Can you tell which process visited that website? Can you tell what the command line args of that process was, what its file hash, what its parent process was? What files did that process open? What other machines on your network did that process subsequently connect to, right? And so on and so on. All this level of detail, obviously your firewall is probably not going to gather that, and if it does, I'd love to meet your firewall. But your firewall's not going to get this, but it shouldn't take a rocket surgeon to realize how valuable this level of information, this level of detail can be when you're doing incident response. And you say, but Travis, I have logs on my endpoints. There's syslog, there's Windows Event Viewer, this information is available. Well, is it really? Because when you're dealing with an incident, when the shit has hit the fan and you have compromised hosts on your network, how do you know you can trust those logs on those endpoints, right? It's pretty much standard operating procedure for any hacker or red team type to go back and start munging the logs on the machine, to the point that you don't actually have that information anymore. Plus, machines, particularly compromised machines, have this nasty habit of crashing or being DOSed or turning off or going home at the end of the day sometimes. We're dealing with laptops. And those logs aren't available anymore. And on top of that, if you're in a situation where you have to look across your network for signs of compromise, are you going to go to each individual hundreds of hosts and try to search the logs by hand? No, you're not. And if you do, I feel bad for you. You're having a bad day at that point. And unfortunately, if anybody here has had the unfortunate experience of using Windows Event Viewer, it fucking sucks, doesn't it? It's terrible. I think it was written in Windows XP and hasn't been updated since. It's a pain in the ass. But maybe somebody knows how to use it, but I surely haven't figured it out. Plus, let's consider this scenario. So a centralized mature logging infrastructure can really make threat hunting easy. So let's say your boss comes in Monday morning, 9 a.m., that's when I show up at work, 9 a.m., and says, oh my God, I watched this documentary over the weekend, I heard about this new travworm virus, whatever. Is there any of this on the network? I need to know right away if we have this infected on our network or if it's ever been on our network. Now, if you have a mature logging infrastructure, this is actually a really easy question to answer, right? A quick little Google search, grab the IOCs, grab the file hashes, the CNC IPs, dump them into a search query on your logging infrastructure, and boom, within 10 minutes, you can answer that question confidently. You can say, no, there is no travworm.exe on our entire network, and yes, I did check every single host. It also makes threat alerting much, much easier. So you can talk to any of the red team presenters we've had over this weekend, and they'll tell you how much they love PowerShell. PowerShell is great. It is ubiquitous. It is installed everywhere, and it is extremely powerful. Yeah, PowerShell. If you're a red teamer, it is the best. If you're a blue teamer, it sucks. Well, it's useful too for blue teamers, it's true. But in a situation, like if an attacker gets on your network, compromises somebody's account or computer, right? And they start executing PowerShell as Debbie for marketing on your database server, well, that's a little bit suspicious, or sus, as the kids say these days, right? Generate an alert, right? And it's actually really easy to do if you have the proper logging infrastructure in place. And you can write one simple query, and you can catch so much stuff just by searching for unauthorized or suspicious PowerShell execution in your environment. Logging also helps you recover with confidence. So let's say you do have an incident, it happens, you get a couple of your servers are compromised and the user had their credentials stolen. Great, fine. You do your due diligence and you go and you clean up those servers, you restore them from backup, you reset the user's password, and so on and so on. But once you've done that though, how confident can you be that those were the only servers on your network that were actually compromised? They were the only ones showing evidence of compromise. They were the only ones, with some malware files on them or whatever, but are you actually certain? How certain can you be if you don't have a record of what actually happened on those servers? If you don't have a record of what that user actually did during the compromised window, it gets a lot harder to respond with confidence, right? And if you're in a situation where you need to know with certainty that the attacker has been completely eradicated from your network, well, I mean, what's the alternative, right? Are you just going to burn the whole thing down? Pave your domain controller? That's a pain in the ass. That's a lot of work and costs a lot of money for the business too. And you'll never be able to answer the question, right? How did the attacker get in the first place? If you don't know how they got in the first place, how are you going to prevent them from doing it again, right? You need to know that information in order to properly respond to incidents. So ultimately, logs are, when properly implemented, your logs are the last line of defense. Right? When your firewall leaks, when your antivirus gets evaded, when your users get spearphished, at the end of the day, you always want to be able to rely on your logs, to go back to the logs and say, hey, this is what actually happened on my network so I can deal with it. So you say, Travis, the sort of thing you're talking about, you keep saying logs and log aggregator and log infrastructure, sounds a hell of a lot like a SIEM is what you're talking about, or a SIEM, a security incident and event manager. And then say, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of overlap between the two. They're kind of basically the same sort of thing, right? Ideally, they're taking in events or logs, they're aggregating them, searching them, indexing, and all that sort of thing. So there's not a ton of difference between the two. But what difference there is tends to be one of focus, right? A SIEM, as its name implies, tends to be focused on security, right? It'll often include built-in threat feeds, certain threat intelligence, or security-focused alerts, right? And it often integrates with third-party security tools like incident response platforms, XDR, and all that shit, right? And of course, it also typically includes the security tax, right? As soon as you label a product a security product, it seems to cost about 3 times as much as it typically would otherwise. Yeah. A log aggregator or a general purpose log aggregator will often is more general purpose and can often answer questions that a SIEM tool can't. So you can often use a general purpose log aggregator to do things like get analytics or metrics based on your web servers, right? So in my experience, for my money, I find it's easier to add security-based sort of features to a general purpose, and often cheaper, log aggregator than to go the other way around. So, but for the purpose of this talk, if it makes you happy, every time I say log aggregator, just think SIEM. I don't really care. They're basically the same thing in my books. So you say, Travis, this sounds great. I want a log aggregator. What do I need to do to get a log aggregator onto my network? And I got to say, whoa, slow down there, buddy. We got to talk about a few things before you take that dive. And one of the first considerations you may be faced with is, are you going to go with like a free version or more of a commercial or paid version, right? And there's a lot of good commercial versions out there, IBM and QRadar, Logarithm, Splunk. I think Trellix is sponsoring this conference. I hear they're pretty good. There's also ones like Forta shit, or sorry, I meant to say, did I say Forta shit? I meant to say Forta goddamn fucking shit. The absolute hot, steaming garbage that's FortiSIEM. Please, for the love of God, stay away from that tool. There's that old saying, if a customer has a bad experience, they'll tell 10 people. Well, this is me telling 100 people how awful FortiSIEM is. Just do not use. But there are good reasons to go with a paid or commercial version, right? People reason, their time is worthwhile. Often the setup experience with commercial versions is a little more streamlined. There's support available, the usual sort of arguments, right? And often the paid or commercial versions will include, extra cutting edge features and some magical proprietary pixie dust, right? That's usually some AI machine learning bullshit branded on the side of it. And to be fair, a lot of these features are in fact worthwhile. I mean, are they worth what you're paying? Maybe, maybe not, but they are decent features. I will grant that. But the problem I had with a lot of paid vendors, a lot of commercial vendors, isn't just that they're expensive. They are expensive, and I am in fact cheap. But my problem is that the pricing model that's often used is perverse. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you're using a log aggregator, you'll find that the more you log, the more valuable your logging data becomes. It's almost kind of quasi-exponential in that regard, right? And when I say more, I mean more both in the sense of more different types of logs, DNS logs, process logs, network connections, all that sort of thing, but also the more hosts, the more devices that you're gathering the logs from. The more of these things you have, the more complete your data set is, the more confidently you can respond to incidences, the better you can draw correlations and connections between events on your network. But typically, for these commercial tools, we'll use a pricing model where they charge you for how much you use it, typically events per second or the number of devices on your network that are enrolled and sending logs. And at a glance, this makes sense. The more you use a tool, the more you should pay for it, right? But the problem is that this financially disincentivizes the customers from maximizing the value that they can derive from the product. You're basically charging them to make the product more useful. And this isn't a theoretical issue, right? I have had far too many heartbreaking conversations with people. They say, Travis, this logging tool, the SIEM, seems great, but it's so expensive. How about I just gather logs from, say, my domain controllers and, say, my SQL servers or something like that? And it's such a hard thing to hear because you know that there is this valuable logging information that is out there, that is on the endpoints, that is your DNS logs or whatever that's not being included, that's just being left on the table and is not made available. That can really impede people from getting the maximum value out of using this sort of tool. Now, there is a better way. Some commercial tools will charge flat license fees, basically based on the size of your organization, right? The number of users, you have 50 users in your organization, you pay this much, and then it's all you can eat, right? They don't count, they don't care how many logs you actually send. You have 50 users, you pay this much. And so there's never any issue about being charged more for using it, for getting too much value out of your tool, right? Because at the end of the day, you want to be in a situation where if you're ever asking, can I afford to log this device? Can I afford to include this type of log? The answer should always, 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 always be yes. So one of the other considerations when you're building out your logging infrastructure is how are you going to get the logs into your centralized collection point, so to speak. And at the end of the day, there's only really two ways of accomplishing this. You're either going to do log forwarding, or you're going to use some kind of agent-based gathering system. Or frequently, you'll end up using some combination of the two. So log forwarding, syslog forwarding, Windows event forwarding, it's been around forever. I can pretty much guarantee your rinky-dink switch from 2003 probably supports some primitive form of syslog log forwarding, right? pretty much the de facto standard at this point. Log forwarding has one of the advantages. It's very lean because it's usually built into the operating system. There's generally not a lot of overhead associated with using built-in log forwarding. Downside to that is not all the logs are usable, and not all of them are particularly useful. Because, for example, Windows event, whatever, gathering, doesn't include DNS logs out of the box, right? That's not part of the object. I don't think Linux does either, right? That information is just generally not available by default. So there are, shout out to, is Raf still here? Yeah, there you are. Yeah, Sysmon will help you out with that, right? If you run Sysmon on your Windows host, it can help you gather a lot of this information that would typically be missing. But that, in a sense, is essentially running an agent at that point, right? So agents provide that kind of additional level of detail and context. If not Sysmon, things like Elastic agents will often hook into the operating system, get you that information. See you there, Dirk. Get you that extra information and include it. Yeah, Sysmon, blah, blah, blah. So why not both? As I said, you'll frequently end up doing both, particularly if you're in a situation where you have like a management VLAN for your switches, and you don't want necessarily to expose that to the rest of your network. You might run a host with an agent on it there that the switches then forward their logs to, and then that forwards them on to your collector. Okay. One of the other big considerations you might have is which logs should you ship? Which logs should you include? Now, a lot of the high-priced consultants will often try to walk you through the idea of using use cases. The idea being, you sit down and you come up with sort of scenarios. What sort of things do you want to detect on your network? For instance, you want to detect people looking up DNS records for malicious websites. Okay, who's going to go to evilsite.com? Well, to do that, I will need my DNS records, my DNS logs. And this has the big advantage. This minimizes the sort of logs you're actually collecting, because you're only collecting the logs that you're actually interested in. And this is a very important step to take when you're on one of that commercial software that is charging you based on events per second, right? This helps you minimize the events per second. I don't particularly like this approach for a couple of reasons. All that time spent working out your use cases and trying to collect the individual logs, that's a process. Oh, shit, already? Wow. Can you make that number a bit bigger? That's fine. I'm almost done, actually. Sitting down and coming up with all those different use cases, that takes time, right? That's time that could be spent actually gathering the logs and storing them instead of trying to figure out what logs you want. And the bigger problem is that it creates this expectation that you know what logs you need ahead of time, when that may not necessarily be the case. Are you sure you came up with every single possible use case ahead of time? Because you don't want to be stuck in a situation where you're responding to an incident and you think, shit, I wish I had thought of that use case beforehand, because now I need those logs and I don't have them. Right? So my preferred method is, yeah, just drink from the fire hose, right? Send the logs. If you have logs, gather them, send them, index them, right? And then later, when you're going through your data set and you can see, oh, shit, I have 50,000 lookups to google.com every day, well, I can pare that out. I can start filtering that out, and I don't necessarily need to log all of this low-value noise, right? And you can start trimming it down that way. Yeah, some essential logs, detailed process logs, things like process creation, parents, command line children, what files a process potentially opened and dropped malicious things, registry modifications. That could be pretty noisy. Obviously, you'll want to make sure you pare that one back, auth logs, things like that. Aside from commercial tools, there are some decent free or cheap as free ways of building out your log infrastructure. I'm not going to go into this because I have less than 5 minutes left. Graylog, Logging Made Easy. These are all well-respected tools for building out this sort of thing. From my own experience, I generally don't like shilling for large companies, particularly large companies that aren't paying me to shill for them. But honestly, I did have a good experience using Elasticsearch relatively in the recent past. There's a fairly large community around it, because it was a real darling of the open source world for a while before they changed their licensing model. But there's still a lot of people using it. There's a lot of Reddit posts. So if you get an error message, you can usually just Google that error message and get your answer 9 times out of 10, because somebody else has had the exact same problem as you, right? Is that going to be true of QRadar? Probably not so much, but at least you then have support that you can turn to. If you do choose to go paid with Elasticsearch, they have a decent pricing model. It's not the best, but it's sane at least. It doesn't disincentivize you the same way some other tools do. And they went fully agent-based in version 8. They made a lot of changes. We made it a lot more user-friendly. And that's just the idea. Just you get the agents onto your systems, however you choose to do so. And then from there, it's really easy. It automatically starts enhancing, enriching your logs, and forwarding them into your system ultimately. So I think that is in fact everything I had to say. So yeah, hit me up. Thank you. Thank you very much. Questions? I have time for questions, in fact. None. Okay. Oh, off the hook. Nice. Oh, wait. No. Oh.
It's kind of a comment to follow up on it. I think any conversation about logging DNS has to include that browsers are now doing and will increasingly be doing DNS over HTTPS.
Yes. Yes. And that is, I think, that's an issue that. Oh, yeah. Sorry, the comment was that when talking about logging DNS requests, we also have to be aware that a lot of browsers are now including DNS over HTTPS, which will obscure, obviously, from that that you can't actually log it because it's encrypted because it's over HTTPS. Yeah, that's something that's definitely a big concern that I think a lot of security practitioners aren't taking seriously. That and also encrypted client hellos as part of TLS 1.3, which will hide the SNI, and you can't be able to see that. So you can't do any web filtering based off of SNI anymore like you could in the past. Yeah, that's definitely a concern that's built into browsers. I don't have a good solution to it. Like there's kind of a whack-a-mole approach that you can take because right now DNS over HTTPS, there's not a lot of DNS servers that support that yet. So you can kind of like try to snipe them and block those particular ones, but that's the path of madness. So I don't really know what the right solution is there at this time.
Do you support DPI or like SSL extraction to kind of get around some of that encrypted DNS and TLS 1.3?
The short answer to that question is when I have my security practitioner hat on, the answer is very yes. When I'm an individual user or I'm the guy who has to worry about the fallout from privacy concerns from that, maybe not so much. But yeah, that is definitely a possibility, right? If you're actually decrypting your TLS traffic properly, then you can start inspecting it and get around the DNS lookups that way. So great idea, hopefully.
We all know that the S in IoT stands for security. Any plans to do any kind of security logging on IoT devices?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, most IoT devices, there won't be an agent available for them, right? So you are relying in that sense on what sort of log forwarding the vendor supports. Again, it'll probably be some form of syslog, and you may be limited by what they're providing. So it is, yeah, that's another thing, another serious concern that people should have when they're trying to build out a logging infrastructure. What IoT devices they have over the network and how they're going to secure that. Whoa, bunch over there. Hello.
Hey, I guess you commented on like log everything.
Yes.
Do you have any comments on log retention?
That's a good question. That depends a lot on whom you ask and what industry you're in can actually provide. The question was, do I have any insights on the idea of log retention, right? How long we keep logs around? Ideally, you keep them around for as long as you can afford to keep them around. Usually most tools, there'll be some trade-off there. The longer you retain your logs, either the more you pay or you won't be able to log as many things at one time. A rule of thumb is probably 3 to 6 months. Again, depending on what industry you're in, you may have specific requirements for retaining logs for a year or more or something like that. But that's something that can definitely drive up the cost of deploying a logging infrastructure if you have to retain your logs for a long time. So what level of security are a lot of these cloud providers are providing for preventing people from accessing this sort of data? Yeah, so a lot of the data that your SIEM tool aggregates could potentially be very useful for an attacker. Like, I mean, ideally, it's more of a record of what's going on your information. It's a record of what's going on your network rather than any actual critical keys or passwords or anything like that. So while it's useful to an attacker, it's usually not super critical information. In some situations it can be, depending on your industry and things like that too. So with most cloud providers, the data is kind of as secure as you're willing to make it. Right? They have usually the tools are in place for you to use use KMS encryption or whatever, and use proper process controls for accessing that. So it's a little bit up to you about how secure that information can be. So I think we had one more.
Yeah, just more of an observation or a
Sure.
recommendation. So what we found in our own practices for like logging with Windows Event Viewer, you are able to like go in and like set the log size and like by general default I think is 128 kilobytes.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we found as best practice is like upping that level to like 512. Do you have any kind of like recommendations or best practices?
Yeah, that's a really good thought. Yeah, before I settled on a proper forwarding infrastructure, right? One of the I forget what it was. Some best practices of Windows is increase the default logging capacity of Event Viewer, because it starts relatively small and you can limit yourself substantially, particularly because Windows Event Viewer is so chatty, or can be. You end up missing, or your logs age out too quickly to be useful. I don't know what good thresholds are. You said, was it 512? 512 megs. Yeah, that's. Yeah, that's a good point. Storage is cheap, right? And it's even cheaper if you're not doing it locally and you do it in a proper aggregated pool sort of thing. So Ron has stood up. That probably means I'm out of time. You have any more? All right, thank you.